Welcome to The One Inside, an internal family systems podcast. I'm your host, Tammy Sollenberger. I'm excited that you and all of your parts have taken time to be with me and all of my parts. If you are a coach, a client, a therapist, if you are in business or education, and you're curious about the IFS model, you are in the right place. Now, let's see what happens on today's podcast. Hey everyone. Today I chat with Requina Barnes and Deran Young. Requina shares her story with me for about the first 30 minutes, and then Deran joins in for the rest of the episode. So before I talk about the episode, I wanted to give you a heads up about where I've been this week. I hoped so much that I just had strep throat or maybe an ear infection. Either would have been okay. But no, I don't have strep throat and I don't have an ear infection. So they tested me for COVID and I still don't know if I have COVID or not. They told me that I probably just had something viral. And honestly, that's what I think it is. I'm having all the symptoms that I normally have when I get sick: sore throat, fever, headache, ears are hurting. All that stuff is super normal for me. But because of COVID, I've had to quarantine in my house. I can't go around my husband. I can't go around my son. I'm even supposed to wear a mask anytime I go into the living spaces. So it's interesting this week that this is happening because one of the things that we talk about briefly in this episode, but actually is a really big trailhead for me, is the idea of how I exile. Well, it doesn't come up this way, but sort of the how I exile racism, how I don't part of my white privilege is that I don't have to think about it or I don't have to deal with it, especially living in New England, which we don't talk about, I think, but maybe we do actually, but because Requina is from New England. So I actually just thought about that for me living in New Hampshire. I have a very different experience than, say, my dad and his family who live in Baltimore. So one of the things that we talk about is exiling. And so I thought about it how even though I know COVID is happening. I know it intellectually. I can see it on the news. I can see it all over social media. I'm even hearing about it. And so I was just thought about this week how when things are too big for me, or when I feel like they're too big for parts, or a part of me feels overwhelmed by them, then I do exile them. So I was thinking about that this week about COVID and about racism and about other things that I exile and just finding that super interesting and definitely a trailhead. So there was definitely some good trailheads for me to follow and to work on my parts with. I just wanted to tell you that. The other thing is I wanted to, which I know this sounds so funny because I just said last week that I rarely give people's bios, but I thought I would go ahead and give you Requina and Deran's bios. Okay, so Requina Barnes specializes in relationships, attachment, and trauma. Through her Boston, Massachusetts private practice, she works primarily with men, women, and couples of color. Requina is a member of the Foundation for Self-Leadership Board of Directors. If you remember, when I talked to Michelle Glass, we did 2 episodes early on, and Michelle Glass talked about the difference between the IFS Institute and the Foundation for Self-Leadership. So those 2 organizations work together, but they do different things. And so Requina is a member of the Foundation's Board of Directors. Sometimes it's just called the Foundation. And she's also the vice president of Black Therapist Rock. She is available for IFS consultation and supervision, and her email is on the show notes. Deran Young is the founder of Black Therapist Rock, an organization that includes over 20,000 professionals committed to reducing intergenerational trauma in marginalized communities. And you know this if you listen to the last episode because her and Brene are friends, but this is super cool. Earlier this year, she was personally recruited by Brene Brown to consult on the inclusiveness of her current belonging statement and to inspire other corporate leaders to operationalize diversity in their organizational practices and policies. I think that's super cool. At the end of this episode, Deran says, and I love this, and I think this is where we need to be. just as people right now, I think we have a choice. And this is what she says. We can go out into the world and we can see people's parts. And that's pretty easy to do, right? We can go out into the world and see people's parts. Or, here, let me say it this way. I can go out into the world and see people's parts. Or I can go out into the world and see self everywhere I look. Enjoy this episode and take care.
I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm actually from Cambridge. I was born and raised in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So
you just never wanted to leave?
I wanted to leave a long time ago.
Maybe one day. Yeah. It's not a bad place to get stuck if you're going to be stuck at hometown. Not a bad hometown to be.
No, it's not a bad hometown, but it's changed a lot. There's a lot of gentrification that has happened in Cambridge since I was younger. So, that's another topic. I mean, it goes with the race stuff, but yeah. So I live in Cambridge, but my private practice was in downtown Boston. And so I would see clients twice a week in the downtown Boston area. And so as far as like my story, so if we rewind and kind of go back to kind of how I got to where I'm at is, let's see, how far back do we want to go? Do we want to go like when I got my social work degree? Do we want to go back to kind of what my experience has been? What would be
Part of me does. Part of me wants to know everything. But so let's say, why don't we just start with how you came to know IFS?
Okay. And so how I came to know the motto of IFS is my therapist. She actually is IFS trained. And I had been working with her since 2011. And she introduced the motto to me in our sessions. And it was really allowing me to do my work differently than I have. I've been in therapy since I was a young adult consistently. And so she used the motto in my sessions and in my treatment, and it helped my parts so much. And my system started to feel so much better. And I said to myself, I was a social worker at the time already. And I said, I want to know how to do this for my clients.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
And so what I did was I enrolled in level 1 in 2014. So after 3 years after being introduced to the model, I enrolled in level 1, took level 1. I took the year-long program, finished that, started to implement it with my clients, but didn't feel like I had enough practice or I knew the model enough. So I went back for level 2 in 2018, got certified, got trained in the level 2. And, I have been working with it, since. And then PAing, I think being a program assistant has been so beneficial because you, like I said, you get to hear the model, but also you get to implement it while you're hearing it, right? Because I use it with my private practice clients, but I feel like I'm in a flow of the model because I understand it and know how to work it and having practice with the practice groups. And so, so I really implemented a lot.
You got it a couple different ways, right? You got it from your own therapy, and then you got it from the training, and then you get it from being a PA where you're hearing it taught again, and then you're implementing it and talking about it and practicing it and teaching it yourself. So it really does get, and it's funny because I feel like I've had the same experience where it takes like a couple rounds. Like it's not just level 1, which is terrible, but it's not just level 1. Like it takes a while because it's a completely different way of doing therapy. It's a completely different way of working with your own system. And so I do think the PA experience is so beneficial.
Yeah.
It was for me.
And I agree. It's just another time consuming thing, right? So it's like, right? Because it's like you're taking the training. So I think it's like, what I say to people who are interested in PA, but be mindful of like overdoing it, right? Because it's like, I think there's sometimes a bug with that. When you start PAing, you feel how great it feels, and then you're like, when's the next one? When's the next one? When's the next
Yeah.
one? And that's something that I've done, and Deran kind of warned me about that, and I didn't listen. And so it's like, like I said, I've been PAing since last year, pretty much back to back.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I'm at with IFS. And talk about certification. The reason why that came out my mouth is because I actually just became certified in IFS recently.
Congratulations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So is that, I'm guessing that's the part of you that's like, what's next? What's next? I want to do it next. I want to do it next. Tell me about that part. I have a similar part.
I think I have a part that just has a hunger for learning.
Yeah.
It's like, and so my hunger for learning is IFS, but it's like the hunger for learning, to want to know more, to want to continue to practice, right? Like there's
Yeah.
something in that part really enjoys. Okay, let's go through it again and
Yeah.
see, like, did we get everything? Let's go through it again and see, like, if we can grab some other stuff. Like, let's go through it again and see where your system is.
Yeah. Well, it's
you
always
know?
changing too, because it's like you go, well, I'll speak for myself that like I'll go to a training and then I come back into my life and I think it's probably the same with people that are alcoholics and stuff, right? They go to rehab and you come back into your life and you're like, nothing's changed in my life. So all those parts that are all calm and have done all this magical work, it's like, oh, it's so hard that they just come back up, I guess, in
Mm-hmm.
real life.
No, I think that's the challenge of, sometimes we talk about it in IFS trainings, right? Like going back to your reality
Yeah.
and knowing, now you're becoming more aware of certain parts, but know that, your family and your friends and your coworkers may not be doing their parts work. And so just
Right.
be mindful of that, because it feels like this bubble of like everybody's so aware and everybody knows their parts. And then you go back to reality and it's like, that's not reality. Everybody
Yeah.
doesn't know their parts.
Yeah.
Everybody's not aware. So I think that, I think you're right. I think that's probably part of the hunger too, right? For that
Yeah. Right.
community and connection.
Yeah.
Because, yeah.
So, how did you get involved with Black Therapist Rock and Deran, and how did that come to be?
Yeah, I got involved with Black Therapist Rock is through IFS, actually. In my level 2, there was a participant that I was in a practice group with. Shout out to Marcy. And she said to me, she said, Requina, I think I know another woman of color that, you would really like, and I said, okay. She said, I'm going to give you her number and you can text her. And, she said, I'm going to ask her first. Long story short, she connected Deran and I. But there's a backstory before Deran and I really even got connected. So I got connected to Deran. However, Deran actually, there was this woman that was working with her that actually reached out to me. And her and I had a couple exchanges as far as like just dialogue and conversation, positive conversations. And eventually, after talking to that woman, I was able to actually connect with Deran. She was like, I have this joke with Deran. I said she was like it's like you kind of have to go through a filter process, and that doesn't sound right. You have to go through a screening process before you get into Deran. So
Was this woman, did she feel like that was her role? Like she was trying to like protect Deran? Is that what it felt like?
no, I think it's just Deran's very busy, and so I think if she is going to engage with a person, she just has to make sure that it's going to be a relationship that is, it's something that can contribute to BTR and the mission versus like somebody just wanting her time or maybe wanting therapy or, so
Yeah.
so
So you're
yeah,
like, I met the requirements.
I met the requirement.
Yes.
And so, so Deran and I eventually did connect, after I went through my process, my screening process, and I passed the test. We kind of joke about that. Um, we met really for the first time at the BTR IFS training last February. Yeah, February 2019. And that's actually the first time we met in person, but also like I feel like we met,
Yeah.
like we really
Yeah.
got to talk and got to know each other. Um, and we really connected. And so since then, Deran and I have, built a beautiful friendship and, partnership as far as, a lot of different things. And, we're both in the IFS community. And so, and there's not a lot of women of color or people of color in the IFS community. And so,
Yeah.
And Deran and I have some similarities. She's a mom too. I'm a mom. Like I said, we're both women of color. We're both business owners. So there's some similarities that her and I have that also connects us.
So can I ask like our stupid white girl question? This will probably be one of many stupid white girl questions I ask.
That's okay. I'm not
Okay.
taking it personal.
Okay. Um, so this is kind of what I want to say is like, is it frustrating? Well, my guess is it's frustrating to be in a room where you're like the only woman of color. And I'm guessing that happens. So this is why I think it's stupid because I'm guessing that probably happens to you all the time. But I'm thinking of IFS community and how there are very few people of color and how I'm wondering what that's like. And then I'm also thinking that that's a really stupid question.
Mm-hmm. It's not a stupid question because I think that, excuse me, that happens a lot. Like it's something that you kind of adjust yourself to going through education. Like in order to be educated, this is kind of what ends up happening. Unless you make other like if I went to historically Black college, it would look different. But I didn't, undergrad or grad school, and so I think you kind of adjust your system to the setting. And I don't think it's not so I think frustrating, yes, it is a description. However, I think there's a part that a lot of people of color who go into higher education or go into advanced trainings for certain things, you have a protector part that knows that this is what it's going to be.
Did you know that going into higher education, or was that something that you were like when you went to high school? Like, was that something you had gotten used to as you go to high school, or is that something that a person of color will be just used to growing up in the United States? That's a common experience of being a minority, whether you go into a store or.
You
So
said as far as like how you grow up.
yeah, so my guess is that's not something that you were like, you walked into college and you were like, oh, I'm the only Black person here, and so I have to get used to that. I'm wondering if that's part of the growing up experience of being Black
Mm-hmm.
in America.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question, actually, because I think it's different for all of us based off of where we grow up,
Yeah,
right?
the
Like
region you're in. Yeah,
the region you're in, the town you're in, the city you're in. I think class has a lot to do with it too,
yeah.
as far as, social class, education has a lot to do with it too. And so my experience, and I feel fortunate about it, is growing up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I didn't experience racism as a child because the elementary school that I went to was probably like 50% students of color, 50% white. And so even if there was subtle racism throughout my childhood, I probably didn't even pick up on it because it wasn't something that was familiar, known. Like race just wasn't a thing growing up for us.
Wow.
And we got very in the school that I went to, I think you know, we just got lucky, all of us kids of color that attended that school, that we didn't have to really endure that. Like, we didn't have to go through like racist teachers or racist kids, or like, we didn't really, it was nice to grow up and not have that be a burden.
Yeah, right.
And so race really didn't, I was very aware of being a woman of color and being a person of color, but I think it was more so as I probably college, even in my the college that I went to was liberal arts. It started out as an all women's college, so it wasn't predominantly white. I actually met one of my best friends who's also a woman of color there, and so I didn't feel that a lot in undergrad. It was probably like as I went into the work world, I started to feel the racism aspects of my life start to kind of come up. And then grad school, definitely.
Wow. Okay. I'm like ignorantly shocked by that. Because I would
Yeah.
assume, again, this is sort of the white ignorance is so in my face right now, and part of me is so angry about it. But I would assume that as you got higher in education, that we're all just so much smarter and that it would be less. But that's not what happened.
No, because that's where the classrooms got all white, right?
Oh,
That's
okay.
where I was the only person of color. Same with work
Wow.
environments. That's when I was the only clinician of color at the table.
Wow. Okay.
Right. And
Yeah.
so this is when the race stuff started in my story, in my journey, because that's when I started being the only one. Not in elementary school, not in middle school, not in high school, not even in undergrad.
So, how did your system respond to that? Like, how did your protective parts protect you or try to help you cope with that?
That's another good question. I think that I was aware that this was something that existed. Um, you know, my mom would talk about it. I would hear, you hear a lot of things. And I don't want to say like race never touched me as far as like growing up. Like I've never had an encounter of, somebody saying something like I had a good friend that was white when I was growing up and her family was racist, and they would, not say blatant things, but I could feel the energy. Right. And
Yeah,
so, I don't want to say like I avoided it 100%, right? It
right.
just wasn't like blatant in my face, thank goodness. And so the way my system adjusted to it was, I think at first, when I first started to encounter it, I'll say in the workforce, I was a little confused about how to respond to it because it's such a hurtful experience that you don't really know what to do, when somebody discriminates against you or, says something, passively racist, or, you kind of really don't know how to respond. So I think it over time, as I've went through more experiences, I started to learn how to advocate for myself, or how to advocate for people who look like me, or how to, and then running into all those dilemmas, right? Like as a woman of color, there's a lot of assumptions about us. When we're passionate about something, we automatically are angry, we automatically are ignorant, we're automatically like all these negative adjectives when we will speak up. And so as I grew in my profession and grew in my experiences, the more I advocated, the more I got pushback. And I also would get I'll say in trouble, right? I would get in trouble a lot. I would get disciplined, if we use a parent-child model, often
Wow.
in the workplace.
Right, right.
Because I was misbehaving, because I was speaking up, I was speaking, against, or I was speaking the truth. And
But because you're
so
a woman of color, that was interpreted
Yeah.
differently or wrongly. It was not interpreted as if you were a white male and you were being assertive or saying, hey, this is wrong, or this isn't
Mm-mm.
okay.
It was always a bad thing to be speaking up about race, or even when, I've had colleagues say racist stuff right in front of me about like families they were working with. And I would like stop the meeting, like, hold on a second, like, can we just stop right here? Because I've been very passionate about, I'm very into fairness and justice. And so, when I see something unjust or hear something unjust, I do everything in my power to advocate or speak up or say something about it. And so I would stop a meeting and it's like, everybody's looking at me like, why are you stop? Like that would be because she's a white woman. She could just say whatever the hell she wants, racist, reckless, whatever. And I'm like, no.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
even like for my parts, like hello.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, so I would speak up and I would get disciplined a lot. I would get in trouble like Requina. There would always just be a negative feedback around it. It would be like, the only person that I can recall in my profession, in a position that I had, was a white male. And I worked under him for 5 years. And he was so like, he understood me as a woman of color and he wouldn't let nobody touch me. Like he was such a buffer and a protector. And, anytime like the program director wanted to say something to me, or he just would be like, he was such a protector to me.
Wow.
And so in that same position, when he left, a white woman took over as my supervisor and all hell broke loose. She was one of the race. I didn't even know she was an undercover racist.
Wow.
And we would have supervision and she would give it to me and I would give it right back to her.
Wow.
But then I got disciplined, right? So now I'm getting action plans and now I'm getting all these,
yeah,
I'm getting all these consequences.
For being a bad girl.
Yep.
Yeah. So how did your parts respond to that? So my parts are like, I'm going to cry and I'll do whatever you want me to do. But it sounds like your parts were like, I don't think so.
Yeah. Well, I think I had gone previously in another work environment. There was a white man who was in charge of this company and he disciplined me too. It was a race, but more of a power and control. He wanted me to do something that he gave me feedback about a client of color and he wanted me to implement what he wanted. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. So he reprimanded me, right? And so that experience made me very emotional. So that was one experience. And so then bringing it back to the experience where it was a white man who was my supervisor, then the white woman took over. It's kind of like, it becomes a dilemma for a person of color when you get to that point with an employer, or with a supervisor, or with a boss, because do you speak up and risk losing your job, or do you comply and do what they want to compromise who you are? That's a big dilemma.
Right.
Right.
Well,
And it
and
depends.
because you're a woman of color, does it feel like it's weightier than that?
Right. I think it depends on the circumstance. I think when it's a one-on-one relationship, for me, it feels more like advocate for myself. When it comes to systems, like a system conversation, then it feels like, okay, I'm speaking up for the whole community or the population or people who are going to come, after me. But in that particular relationship, I'm like, do I speak up and compromise my job, or do I not speak up and compromise who I am?
Yeah.
And it was unfortunate because I even went to the CEO of the company and she basically was like, well, you need to, and she was a woman of color, and she basically was like, well, you're gonna have to just figure it out.
Yeah.
So that's a system issue, right? Because it's like, she didn't even, the Black woman at the top didn't even want to recognize that there was racism happening within her agency. And so I think that, that discourages people like me who are educated, have master's degrees and have the opportunity to grow in companies like that, they actually discourage you from staying in the company, which I feel like is part of the game, right? Like if you stay in that company and you're educated and qualified, that means you're due for promotion and you can get to the top, right? We don't want that. We don't want you at the top. We want you to stay where you're at. It's all a strategy. It's racism strategy. It's system. It's the way that the systems, kind of protect themselves, right? It's like the more people of color you have in positions of power, most agencies don't like that, but to have all white people at the top, they like that.
So as you're saying that, are you noticing anything? Like I'm noticing that I'm like pissed and I want to throw up a little bit. Mm-hmm. So what are you noticing as you say that?
I mean, I think that's a good assess, it's a good assessor for me to kind of listen to my parts, because I think my system gets activated when I tell this story because it was so painful.
Yeah.
And I feel like I couldn't do anything about it, and
so your parts were feeling a little helpless.
Yeah, they were feeling helpless. They were also feeling underappreciated, because I think, this particular agency I worked at for a long time, and I committed myself and I really enjoyed the position. And, I was able to work with a lot of different, it just was a good job for me. And so when this racism and white supremacy stuff started to come up, it just affected me so much. And it just was like, okay, like, I'm not going to do this, and them just justifying their white supremacy.
Yeah.
It actually makes me sad, but also it makes me sad for myself who experienced that years ago, but it makes me sad for other women of color like myself who go into that system and run, unless you comply, get out. That's the message.
Yeah.
Right. And so, people who are more vocal like myself, like, usually don't last in those type of systems because it doesn't work for us,
Does it make some of your parts hesitant to then enter other systems that are white male dominated?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't even think it's white male. I think it's white male, white female, because sometimes, I mean, I think that experience that I was telling you, like, not the experience with the white male who owned the company, but the white supervisor who I had for 5 years, I really am thankful to him and the experience he gave me to actually, the reason why I probably lasted so long in that position was because of him. Right. And so it was when I got a white woman that everything hit the fan.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so I don't even think it's white male, it's white people.
Yeah.
White organizations, even if they have a lot of people of color working for them, what levels are those people of color? Are they the direct service people, or are they manager or in leadership? Like, so the reason why I actually went into private practice, that experience had a lot to do with why I went into private practice. I always wanted to go into private practice, but that experience, I was like, I will never put myself in a situation like that again. To have to either choose my job or compromise who I am as a person.
Right.
Mm-mm. Yeah. Or to let people think they have that much influence and power over my career. Like, never.
So, okay. So my guess is that if you're a person of color, that you have parts probably growing up that become more cynical or more protective or more boundaried with white people, and that you learned that growing up, but you didn't learn that, like the parts you didn't learn that, I'm putting that in quotes, until you're in grad school, and then it actually deepened in this gross experience with this work. So do you feel like you had parts that were like, I had to learn that later in life, and that's something that you don't really even want to learn, but you ended up having to learn?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the underlying was always there, right? Because like I said, my mom would like have conversations and I would learn certain things, but I think practice didn't happen until later.
Right, the experience of it, right? Like, so I can know intellectually that it's really hard to have like people be mean to you. Like, oh my gosh, it's terrible when people are mean to you, and that's
Mm-hmm.
terrible. But then to have the experience of someone being mean to me is a
Mm-hmm.
completely different thing than me knowing about it and then having the experience.
Right,
I always
right.
say that about IFS, right? I can teach IFS or I can
Mhm.
help you have an experience with your own parts, and that's going to
Right.
be a completely different thing.
Mm-hmm. And I think because it happened for me later, as I was an adult, um, I don't want to say I was kind of more prepared because, I talked about how it's confusing when it starts to happen, but I think my system was more ready to deal with those type of challenges and injuries.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I almost wonder because you almost had more resources or you had been successful or you had been, so you're like, no, 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 no. This isn't how we play here.
Right, 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 right. And I think that's why my personality of like advocating and speaking up for myself and just being honest with people, sometimes some people don't like that and sometimes people do because it's but I think like you said, um I wasn't so tainted, right?
Right.
Like my upbringing was in a place of, I didn't have to go through all those injuries. I've had other injuries but not racism injuries, and so
Right.
I think when it happened, that's why I was able to show up the way that I was able to show up too.
Yeah, 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 that makes
Like,
sense.
I know this is not how this is supposed to work. Like, I'm not just gonna go along to get along.
Deran joins the conversation, and here's what she has to say about her own protective parts around racism.
I was just thinking about how like that is a protective part of me. Is like, I want to be seen as good, or I want to be seen as like right. And that's so like, growing up in racist South Texas, you know what I mean? Like just trying to get things right. And it's like there's no right way to be. There's no definition for being good. And
Mm.
there's no reward for it either, Deran. Like,
Mm. So you have a part that says, if I'm good, then I'll have a reward, or there'll be less consequences, or something will be better. If as long as I'm good, as long as I'm good.
then Black people won't look bad,
Oh, okay, because I represent Black people. So I,
right?
I represent Black people as a woman of color and as the head of Black Therapist Rock. I represent Black people, so I have to be perfect and good. So then, yeah, because I'm the representative. Does that sound right?
Sounds horrible, but yeah, that's
No,
the
why it
inner
sounds
child.
horrible? What do you
No,
mean?
no, like when I hear it outside of me, I'm like, God, that sounds like Joanne, that's horrible. Part of me judges that, like, that's yuck, that's not who you want to be, but that there's a voice in there that's like, we got to represent everybody. And that's, it's so like stereotypical, I guess.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is Requina and I actually, Requina has a completely different experience. We were just talking about that. Requina, do you
Yeah,
want to say something about that? Because that's not your experience at all. Being
right.
raised in New England and having a
Mm-hmm,
very different experience growing up and being
mm-hmm.
a part of an agency and being like, I don't care if you see me as good, I'm gonna
Right.
advocate for myself.
And I think that's the part of me that's attracted to her. You know what I mean? Is like because she's a very good advocate for standing up for like what she believes and what she thinks is right. And I'm good at that too. But I have other parts, like it's a polarization. Like part of me was
Yeah.
like, don't say anything. I was just looking at this list of characteristics of adult children of dysfunctional families, and it was like it's saying like feeling overly responsible. You know what I mean? So like I go from like wanting to be good and wanting to be seen, approval seeker is what it talks about. Approval seeker, like losing your identity, to the complete opposite. I'll be responsible for everybody. Like, like I'll just take the lead. And so it's like I'll either fight the system and be totally like against something, or I'll just be like, no, this is all of us and I'm taking that charge up. There's no middle ground. It's like a all or nothing.
Yeah. And you have, my guess is you have this part of you that really criticizes yourself and says that's horrible. And then, but what I'm hearing is exhaustion.
Yeah.
Which then we know then just probably like perpetuates it, because then you are too tired and you then feel like you can't give even a good enough, forget like your best, but even sort of a good enough, because you're just so exhausted.
Yeah.
Yeah. Requina, how are you doing with listening to Deran? And I'm just noticing the huge difference in
She
like
got
us.
so quiet. I know.
Well,
She's
the
feeling
difference.
guilty about my part. And I was like, I'm not saying that for you to feel guilty. Like, oh, I was anxious. No, it's just a reality for me. Like, I take everybody else's anxiety and make it my own. Like when I care about somebody, I'm like, oh, let me take that for you. Because that's what I did in my childhood. Like I took all the feelings and I was like the keeper of the feelings in the family.
Yeah, well, you were the oldest child and you needed to protect those two sisters.
Yeah.
Yeah, and probably your mom too, right? Trying to protect her in some way, maybe. All right, Requina, how are you doing down there? Because
No,
Duran's making some assumptions about how you're feeling, and I don't know that that's right.
I feel fine. I don't feel guilty. I know it's parts, and I think that, a lot of, I have a part that just wants to like update Deran on like where we've gone. And so I think a lot of the conversation Tammy and I've been having is growing up in Cambridge and kind of like me not really having racism be a thing until, I got to my young adulthood, which I was pretty fortunate about. And so fortunate to have that not happen, but not fortunate, right? Because it's like, who wants to ever deal with racism, right? Like, it's a luxury to not have to deal with racism. And so I just was kind of walking Tammy through my experience as far as, when racism really hit for me, which was more really in grad school. And then as I was developing my professional career, and what that was like for me, and even the parts that would come up who had to speak up or wanted to speak up or knew that, it was either I compromise my job or I compromise who I am. And me compromising who I am is never that's not an option, and so I think that, being able to speak on that and just assessing, the parts that would come up for me. I think that going through the experience and talking about it, Tammy was like, how do your parts feel? And it was able for me to kind of get back into my body and see what was going on in my system, which was really helpful because, I had a few painful experience, but, this experience I was talking about, and I could see my parts got pretty activated. Right. And it's been a while. It's been years since I had that unpleasant experience, but, the parts are still aware of what happened. So that's kind of where we've gone.
What do you want people to know? Like, what is it you want people to know? Or what do you want to share? Or what do you want people to hear about anything about your experience or about all that's happening in the world? And one of the things that I feel like has come up for me is embarrassment of white ignorance around racism. Like, it feels embarrassing to me that after George Floyd died, we're all like, what? And I'm like, that's you should be embarrassed. Either me or all these white people that are now on like these putting these social media things up. I'm like, you should be embarrassed.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm talking to my own parts. So I guess I'm curious about how you two are doing as women of color. I'm using that phrase because Requina taught me that, because I'm like, oh, I've not said that before. So
yeah, I'm like, I'm black, blackity, black, black, black.
Well, and I'm
But
like this
some
with,
people prefer like a person of color, a woman of color. For me, I'm like, I'm just black.
yeah, I don't, yeah. And how many white people are just don't know? They want to know. Right? I think that's the other thing, right? Is I want to know. I don't want to be ignorant and I don't want to be racist. I mean, I have
Right.
racist parts, definitely. I have
Right.
racist parts, definitely. And that's okay. You both are shaking your head yes, and I just want the audience to know that, like, yes, it's okay to admit that. It is
Right.
worse to not admit that because that's your
Right.
ignorance. Am
Right.
I getting that? I'm like, am I right on that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think like one of the things that came to mind as you were talking, Brene Brown says like shame is a horrible social justice tool. So like when we should all over ourselves or just shame ourselves for where we are, but this is where society is. You know what I mean? Like racism hasn't been a conversation that America has had, but really needed to have for a very long time. So
Yeah.
part of me was angry. Like, why now? Like, why are we just now having these conversations? And these companies are like all donating money and pretending as if, like, oh, we're so concerned. And it's like it took someone being murdered on video for you to care. You know, so I do have a part that thinks that. So, oh, geez, a part that thinks that sometimes, but I also am more like, well, embarrassment doesn't help us. It doesn't serve us, you know, like the shame, it doesn't, you know, and to me, it then centers the feelings of white folks, you know, like
Yeah.
then it turns
Right.
it, and that's to me why the U-turn is so important. Like, oh, I'm making this about me now. So what is
Yeah.
this? Why, how am I making this about me? Like, why am I making this about me? What am I afraid would happen if it wasn't about me?
Yeah.
Like if
That's
it
good.
legit was about the fact that, you know, black and brown people are hurting right now,
Yeah.
why
So
why is it so hard to just sit with that?
because
You
it's,
know?
can I speak to that? Because it
Uh,
is so overwhelming. It's to me as you're saying that, and I said this to Requina earlier. It's so overwhelming. It makes me want to throw up, and it gives me this feeling of helplessness that it's like
right,
I can't even I can't even hold it. It feels so huge and horrible that I can't even. It's like I want to turn the channel because it's too
right.
big for me. That's how it feels.
And I think that's how we got here. Like I think that, like you said, acknowledging those parts are the first step, because then like black and brown people don't have to be kept like help be like holding the burden. You know what I mean? I was just writing an article yesterday and I was thinking like, we're not your exiles. You know what I mean? Like you don't get to exile me. You know what I'm saying? Like it feels like we've been pushed away and pushed to the side and like, oh, I'm just gonna turn the channel on Deran and her experience and her pain. Nope, not ready to go there. You know, anybody that looks like her don't wanna deal. And like you said, it's such a privilege to be able to turn away and not look, like, because the exhaustion of it. And that's the one thing that I always want people to know is like racism is something that is so like subtle that you don't even realize that you've been traumatized about it until years later. And it is a part of your everyday experience, for me anyway. Like it is a part of what I worry about, how much I worry, you know, like, and I can't even, the depths of it is so deep that I'm always finding new aspects of it, you
Yeah.
know? So I'm like, I don't think that, you know, of course we would love to turn away. Like, I don't want
Yeah.
to admit these things about myself, that I carry white supremacy parts inside of me too, that tell me who I am isn't enough, you know?
Mm, right.
That's a big thing to heal from. But we all gotta, like, we all have a part of that if you live in America.
Yeah. Rakina, what do you want to say about what Duran is saying? Is something you want to say about that?
Yeah, I think Deran brings up a good point as far as always on your radar. You know, when you walk out your house, it's like, you know, being a person of color is always on my radar. And then having children of color, particularly a son of color, is always on my radar, right? Like my son's, you know, he's 11. He started saying, you know, Mom, can I just walk around the block? And, you know, I grew up here and I feel pretty comfortable, but my anxiety went through the roof. And I even started talking to Deran about it. Like, I feel so nervous. Like, we live in a safe neighborhood, but he is a brown boy, you know, and, you know, he's getting taller and, you know, so like my anxiety levels, like, you know, I'm like biting my nails waiting for him to come back home, you know, and he's just a kid being innocent and just, you know, he's like, I just want to get some fresh air. And I'm like, well, what about, you know, and the police in my town, thank God, you know, they're average. Let's just say that. No, they're below average, but they, whatever, I think the culture of the town, as far as the makeup. So that's one thing. The other thing is like, what about unsafe people like that might see him walking around? Like, so all these things were kind of going through my radar, like Deran was saying. And this is something that happens for us individually. But then, if we're moms, particularly moms of Black boys, that's another layer of anxiety and worry. Yeah. So your mind is always like on alert.
And I think for me, like I've tried not to pass it down, but I know like it's a legacy burden that Amir probably carries too. Like I'm always trying to make sure he looks good. Like because it's a matter of safety. It's not a matter of like vanity. Like if he doesn't look good in society, he won't survive.
It's a matter of safety.
Survival. Yeah.
Wow.
Like this is how he has to navigate this white supremacy culture. He has to look good.
Wow.
My mom told me very early, like, you got to work twice as hard. You got to, you know what I mean? And I was just thinking about, like, going back to the adults of dysfunctional families. Because I feel like we're, like, part of this dysfunctional family of America. You know what I mean? And so, like, one of the things it says is that we've stuffed our feelings from our traumatic childhoods and have lost the ability to feel or express how we're feeling because it hurts so much. Like I don't want to admit that these things that I'm saying, I'm like, this hurts so much to say out loud.
Yeah.
So you just stuff it and you like cover it up with so many other things that's so buried deep inside of us. And there is so much shame attached to it, like.
Yeah.
There's just so much shame around it all the way around. So for me, it's been very therapeutic and very like healing to talk about it, especially to white people. Because I feel like they need to know, and I need to be able to say it.
Yeah.
Because it brings me out of that denial.
Yeah. Well, in those parts that feel alone in it, the parts that have been alone in, I have to teach my son that he needs to look nice and he needs to talk a certain way, and it's his safety, it's his life. And to be able to say that, wow, I do that. There's a part of me that does that, to be able to say that and have that be held and witnessed for you.
Right. And I think for me, what's been like lately, what's been even more on my radar, because he's like one of the only boys in our family. I didn't grow up with my father. I don't have uncles, so there's just a lot of women in my family. And I've been thinking about the fact that every woman in my family is depressed. Every single last woman. My aunties, my mother, my grandmother, my sisters. I'm like the only one. I mean, I'm depressed too, but I'm like the only one who's actually aware of it and like has the resources to heal. But, I just see like this mass depression across Black people, and we're all wondering why. And it's like, we look at the water we're swimming in, is full of it. It's full of like low self-worth and lack of identity and confusion and, just depression and denial of our experience.
Right.
Hurt, and you're not allowed to say it hurts.
And I would add to that pool of stuff is addiction, right? And so it's like the mental health and the addiction. So, Deran, classified it great. It's like this pool of stuff that we're up against, that brings all those, your mental health gets magnified, your addictions get magnified. And so, what does that mean for self? What does that mean for your children? What does that mean for your relationships? It's like all connected, right? So yeah, it's challenging if your mental health is compromised to deal with all these systems and all these issues that are against you, and to be able to recover or to be resilient and bounce back. And it's an ongoing a life experience.
I have a part of me that's like, but I'm not a victim, I also don't want to be a victim. Like, I know that being Black is a blessing, I have to remind myself, like just last night when I was tossing and turning, I was reminding myself, like, it took my mother a great deal of courage to even have me, like The abortion was paid for. She was 16 years old. I'm sure my dad was like, I don't want to be a teen parent. And I was thinking about the fact that like she gave birth to me and she chose me for the two of them. Like when I think about the amount of rejection that's in my system around racism, and I think about like just all that our ancestors did, to ensure that I could be here, the suffering that they experienced, just so that I could exist. So I guess that the stakes do feel very high for me a lot of times, because I know that, like there's just been so much passed down to us. So many rights that we wouldn't have had, so many privileges, so many resources, so much access, like the fact that we could be Black therapists. I always, when people are asking me like, why am I so passionate about working with Black therapists, I tell them like, for us to get here, it takes a lot, for us to be willing to talk about mental health in a stigmatized community, for us to acknowledge our own mental health needs and issues, for us to, do that with clients that are Black. It's an act of resistance. And it's not something that we just stumble upon. It's like we have lived experience, and it's a challenge. Like we're up against a very racist system, even in mental health and healthcare, and we're navigating that with our own stuff at the same time. So to me, it's like we're like almost like superheroes, like super self. Like it takes a lot of confidence and courage and just passion.
Yeah.
To create safe spaces for other people when there hasn't been one for you.
Yeah.
And I like that too, Deran. Like, you said, I'm proud to be Black, and I'm proud to be Black too. And I think that's what allows, us to go through these experiences and still be proud of who we are, because being who we are is not compromised based off of a system or a person or experience. It's like, I'm not going to ever deny who I am. Regardless how you feel, what you think, what isms you have towards me, I am who I am. And so I like how you said that too. Being proud of who you are in the midst of all these challenges, I think helps in the process as well, to be able to educate other people or assist other people. Assist yourself, because that's where it starts.
Requina, what do you mean by that? Assist yourself. Tell me what that means.
I think what Deran was alluding to, heal, love yourself enough to heal and understand how all your experiences have impacted you, so you don't just pollute, polluting the future generations and keep passing on more dysfunction. You have to bring it back to you, right? Because that's how all the legacy burdens happen. That's how dysfunction happens, right? It's systems, but it's also self, right? I think Deran brought up, all the females in her leaning, legacy in her family history have depression. I probably the same for mine too. And so what do we do about it? Having that information, right? Self, in this generation, start to heal our own depression and anxiety and maybe other character things that we have that we want to improve, so that we don't just pass it on to our children who are going to pass it on to our grandchildren, right? Like, be able to start here. And that's where IFS comes in. That's where the model can be so powerful, is to come back to self, work with your parts, be open to working with your parts, unburdening some of those parts, and be able to free those parts up to be able to be the advocate, to be able to be the to be, I don't want to say spokesperson because I don't always like that word, but to be able to be a leader.
To be seen, to show up and be seen.
Right.
Yeah.
And not be exhausted.
Right. Well, and that was so beautiful. And what I'm hearing though is it's like those parts, whether it's depression parts, anxiety parts, substance use parts, all those parts are really trying to help you. And it's like, okay, if you start to see those parts with compassion and see how they're all trying to help me, and then get enough space that you can look back and say, wow, my mom chose me. My mom and dad chose me. And in the legacy, like how many generations had to make hard survival choices so that I could be here and I could survive. Like, you need to have some space from your parts in order to see that.
Right. And I was just telling a friend yesterday, like now that I'm like out of the military, which is also another highly stigmatized community when it comes to mental health, like I've gone most of my life feeling like mental health is not something you talk about out loud, or, like you don't air your dirty laundry. But now I'm like starting to lean into my mental health and like get really up close and personal with it. And I'm like, oh, my depression is here to tell me when things are, like when the external constraints are just too high, like when things are just feeling like overwhelming. And it's important to pay attention to that. Like I couldn't pay attention to that as a kid. Like things were overwhelming and it was like, just ignore that, like keep going, don't look at it. And now I'm like, no, I need to look at that. That's like a warning sign for me to pay attention to what's going on and how I'm feeling. Like what's being activated, what's going on, why. Let's ask the question, like, what has happened because of what happened,
Yeah.
And I'm like, it's normal for me to feel depressed right now. That's what I just keep telling myself. Like I'm grieving, you know what I mean? I feel like most of us are grieving as a country. Everybody is having like this experience of, oh wow, whatever we had before is changing, and we can no longer pretend. So it's almost like, okay, now it's time to do the grief work,
Yeah.
that we've been putting off for so many years.
Well, and the idea though that self is going to be right there with us, and self is right here with us. So I'm not alone in my grief. I'm not alone in my, what's up for me is that like my feeling of being so overwhelmed by the issues of race and being so uncomfortable with it, like that self can be right there with me. So I don't actually have to push it away, because self can actually just be right here with me. I don't have to exile those feelings because I have self, and self can help me just sit with it and sit with that feeling of uncomfortableness, and self can just be right here with me. And that helps me feel not as overwhelmed and not as helpless and not as hopeless. And I can feel calm, clear, compassionate, creative, etc. Because I have self.
Yeah. And I think for me too, self like keeps me out of isolation. Because I think that's another byproduct of racism is like you learn to isolate. Like I can only trust me against the world. I've heard so many people, black people, it's like, oh, who do you trust? It's like me, that's it. And that's a very isolating place to operate. But when I tap into like, my higher self, I'm like, no, Deran, that's not what we need. Like we need community. We need to, again, give words to our pain. We need to not hide and shame. We need to actually connect, either with myself or with somebody that I trust, somebody outside of me that I can trust too. Now that I'm learning that, that's a form of trauma, that racism, takes away your ability to be vulnerable and to trust others. And that's like one of the biggest aspects of the trauma. It's like it leaves you feeling like you're in it by yourself.
So self can be with those parts that are scared to trust, and self can be with those parts, and then that opens up some space for you to trust and then learn something different. Because otherwise you don't learn anything different. You continue to learn, I can't trust, I can't reach out, I have to stay just trusting myself and relying on myself. And then I'm exhausted.
Yep. Perfect little shame spiral.
Yeah. So we're pretty much out of time. Is there anything else either one of you want to say?
That's something else that I guess I would love to leave in the podcast. As Chris said, when he got out of his level 1 training so many years ago, he went out to the world. It was like, oh my God, the world is full of parts. And he said about a decade later, it took about 10 years to change that and to evolve it. And he said now he goes out into the world and he sees self everywhere. And so I think it's just such a beautiful way to like change your perspective. Like if you're looking for pain and trauma, you will find it. But if you're also looking for love and connection and people who are brave enough to show up for themselves and for others, you'll find that too.
That's beautiful. Requina, do you want to say anything?
Thank you, Tammy. Thanks, Deran. This was great. I really enjoyed spending this time.
Thanks for hanging out today. If you liked this episode, make sure you subscribe. And if you really like this episode, share it with a friend and leave a review. You can follow me on Instagram at IFS Tammy and join our community on Facebook at the One Inside Podcast. Talk to you next time.
Today's episode was sponsored by Brighter Vision. What's the point of having a beautiful website if it doesn't attract the clients you want to see? As the worldwide leaders of website design for therapists, Brighter Vision sees this issue happen way too often. A nice-looking website doesn't equate to a successful website. The truth is, your current website might even be turning off potential clients. That's where Brighter Vision comes in. Brighter Vision's team of website designers will create a website that is centered around attracting and retaining your ideal client so that you can have a nice-looking website as well as a successful one. Better yet, Brighter Vision is offering $100 off exclusively for listeners of the One Inside podcast. To take advantage of this offer, simply go to brightervision.com/inside. Again, that's brightervision.com/inside.